On the afternoon of June 17, 1775, roughly 2,500 British soldiers march up a grassy hill outside Boston in perfect parade ground formation, confident they are about to teach a disorganized mob of colonial farmers a brief and humiliating lesson. By the end of the day, that hill will belong to the British. It will also be covered with more British dead and wounded than any single battle of the entire war that follows, and the officers watching from Boston will walk away from their own victory badly shaken. This is the story of a battle the British technically won, and lost anyway, in a way that would shape how they fought and how much they feared fighting for the rest of the American Revolution. To understand why this hill mattered so much, you have to understand exactly where things stood in Boston 2 months into what was already turning into a war. On April 19, 1775, British troops marching to seize colonial military supplies at Concord had clashed with local militia at Lexington, and by the time the British column made it back to Boston that evening, colonial militia harassing them from behind trees and stone walls, the entire route had inflicted serious casualties on a supposedly superior professional army. In the weeks that followed, colonial forces from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island poured into the countryside around Boston, eventually numbering somewhere around 15,000 men under the nominal command of General Artemas Ward, a force that was, in most meaningful respects, still an undisciplined collection of local militia companies rather than anything resembling a unified army. Boston itself sat on a peninsula, largely protected by water and by a Royal Navy fleet controlling the harbor, and the roughly 5,000 to 6,000 British troops garrisoned inside the city under General Thomas Gage found themselves effectively surrounded on land by an army of citizen soldiers that, on paper, had no business being able to contain a professional force at all. Gage, for his part, was under real political pressure from London to demonstrate that the rebellion could be crushed quickly and decisively, and he had recently been reinforced by 3 additional generals sent specifically to help him do it: William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Bergen, all of whom would go on to play far larger roles in the war still to come. When Gage learned in mid-June that colonial leaders intended to fortify high ground overlooking the harbor, he began planning to seize the same high ground first, understanding correctly that whoever controlled those hills could threaten the British fleet and the city itself with artillery. The colonial militia leadership reached the same conclusion just in time to act first. On the night of June 16th, roughly 1,000 to 1,200 colonial militiamen under the command of Colonel William Prescott marched onto the Charlestown Peninsula with orders to fortify Bunker Hill. For reasons that remain somewhat unclear to historians, the men instead constructed their main fortification on Breed's Hill, a smaller rise that sat lower and considerably closer to Boston itself, a decision that would put them well within range of Gage's warships, but also make the position significantly more provocative and visible. Working through the night in near total silence, so effectively that British sentries posted only a few hundred yards away noticed nothing unusual, Prescott's men dug a compact earthen redoubt atop Breed's Hill and extended a line of lighter fortifications, including a rail fence reinforced with loose hay, running down toward the water to protect their exposed left flank. By the time the sun came up on the morning of June 17th, British lookouts and sailors aboard ships in the harbor were stunned to see a fully constructed fort sitting on ground that had been empty pasture the evening before. Warships in the harbor opened fire on the position almost immediately, a bombardment that did little real damage to the earthworks, but made clear that the British had noticed exactly what had happened overnight. Gage convened his senior officers to decide how to respond. Clinton reportedly favored landing troops behind the peninsula to cut off the American position entirely, trapping Prescott's men on the peninsula with no route of retreat at all, a plan that might have ended the battle before it properly began. Gage and Howe instead chose a direct frontal assault straight up the hill, a decision that reflected supreme confidence in the discipline of British regulars against what they still regarded as an amateur rabble that would break and run the moment real professional soldiers advanced on them in formation. By early afternoon, somewhere between 2,200 and 3,000 British troops had been ferried across the harbor and formed up in Charlestown at the base of the peninsula, moving up the slope in tight, disciplined ranks under the weight of full equipment in the summer heat, a burden that included heavy wool uniforms entirely unsuited to the conditions. Along the American line, ammunition was in desperately short supply, and whichever officer actually gave the order, whether it was Prescott, Israel Putnam, John Stark, or someone else entirely, the instruction that spread down the American line that afternoon has survived as one of the most famous lines of the entire war. Do not fire until you can see the whites of their eyes. It is worth being honest about this line. Modern historians generally consider it more legend than verified fact, a phrase with earlier origins traced back to European commanders more than a century before, including the Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus, and later reused by British General James Wolfe at Quebec. Whether anyone actually said those specific words on Breed's Hill that day or not, the tactic behind it was very real. The Americans held their fire deliberately, letting the British advance to devastatingly close range before finally unleashing a synchronized volley directly into the tightly packed ranks climbing toward them. The effect was immediate and brutal. British soldiers fell in rows, and the first assault broke apart and retreated back down the hill in disorder. One American defender later described the moment vividly, writing that the British had advanced toward them expecting to swallow the defenders whole, but instead found what he called a choky mouthful. Howe reformed his shattered lines and ordered a second assault, marching his men back up the same exposed slope, past their own dead and wounded from the first attempt, lying, according to one account, as thick as sheep crowded into a fold. The result was almost identical. The American line held its fire again until point-blank range, and a second devastating volley tore through the reformed British ranks, sending them reeling back down the hill a second time, leaving Howe standing nearly alone at one point among his own dead and wounded staff officers. If you are learning something from this breakdown, take a second and hit subscribe. We cover overlooked turning points in battles like this every week, and what happens on this hill next is about to change how seriously the British take this war. By the time Howe organized a third attempt, the tactical situation on the hill had fundamentally changed, though not in a way visible to the British climbing toward it. Prescott's men were nearly out of powder and shot, reduced in some accounts to loading their muskets with whatever scraps of metal and gravel they could improvise. When the British came up the hill a third time, reinforced by fresh troops, and this time ordered to advance with bayonets fixed, while some artillery pieces were repositioned to rake the rail fence line with grapeshot, the Americans simply could not sustain the kind of volley that had broken the first two assaults. Ammunition ran out at critical moments along the line, and British soldiers reached the redoubt itself for the first time, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand fighting with bayonets against defenders who, for the most part, had no bayonets of their own to answer with, forced to fight with clubbed muskets, rocks, and whatever else was at hand. The redoubt fell, and Prescott ordered a retreat off the peninsula, covered by soldiers including John Stark's New Hampshire men, who had reinforced the rail fence position on the American left, the exact spot the British had originally planned to target. Among the Americans killed covering that retreat was Dr. Joseph Warren, a prominent Boston physician and one of the most important political organizers of the early Revolution, who had helped send Paul Revere on his famous ride 2 months earlier and had just been commissioned a major general days before the battle. Rather than exercising his new rank, Warren had chosen to fight in the ranks as a volunteer, and he was killed in the final retreat, becoming one of the earliest and most significant martyrs of the entire war. The battle also produced a documented account of black soldiers fighting with distinction in the American ranks that day, including a soldier named Salem Poor, whose conduct was considered remarkable enough that 13 American officers, including Prescott himself, later signed a formal petition to the Massachusetts legislature praising him for having behaved, in their words, like an experienced officer as well as an excellent soldier. When the fighting stopped and the smoke cleared over Breed's Hill, the casualty figures told a story that should have terrified anyone in Boston celebrating a British victory. British losses ran well over 1,000 men killed and wounded out of a force of roughly 2,200 to 3,000 engaged, with the most commonly cited figures putting the dead somewhere around 220 to 280, and the wounded at close to 800, meaning close to half of every British soldier who climbed that hill became a casualty by the end of the day. American losses, while still serious, were roughly half the British total, generally cited around 140 killed and 270 wounded, including Major Andrew McClary, reportedly the final American casualty of the day, killed by cannon fire during the retreat itself. British officers were hit especially hard, a detail that would matter enormously in the months ahead, since experienced officers were far harder to replace quickly than ordinary infantrymen, and several of Gage's most capable field commanders were among the wounded. British General Henry Clinton, who had watched the assault and argued unsuccessfully for a different tactical approach beforehand, reportedly described the outcome afterward as a dear-bought victory, a phrase that captured exactly how hollow the win felt to the men who had actually paid for it. One British officer, writing home about his own commanding generals, put the lesson even more bluntly, noting that they had expected to punish a mob and instead found themselves fighting troops that would look them in the face without breaking. The consequences of Bunker Hill rippled through the rest of the war in ways far more significant than one hill outside Boston. Badly depleted and shaken by the cost of the assault, the British abandoned further plans to seize additional high ground around the city and effectively settled into a defensive posture inside Boston for the rest of the siege. A full 9 months of stalemate that followed, broken only by occasional raids and skirmishes rather than another major pitched battle. The city was finally evacuated in March of 1776, once Continental artillery, hauled overland from Fort Ticonderoga on ox-drawn sleds by Henry Knox, was mounted on Dorchester Heights and made the British position in the harbor untenable without a fight. The British no longer had any appetite for repeating. The staggering casualty rate at Bunker Hill also directly convinced British military planners that they needed far more manpower than their existing regular army could easily provide, accelerating the decision to hire tens of thousands of German mercenary troops, most of them from the region of Hesse, to bolster British numbers for the campaigns that followed across the rest of the war. An expense that added enormously to the overall cost of a conflict London had originally hoped to resolve quickly and cheaply. Just weeks after the battle, George Washington arrived in Cambridge to take command of the newly designated Continental Army, inheriting a force that had just proven, at tremendous cost, that it could stand and trade volleys with British regulars under the right conditions, even if it could not yet sustain that kind of fight indefinitely or supply itself reliably enough to do it twice. For the colonists, despite losing the ground, Bunker Hill functioned as proof that reconciliation with Britain was no longer realistic, and that armed resistance could actually work against the same soldiers who had, until that afternoon, seemed practically invincible. For the British, it was the first hard evidence that this war would not be the quick, one-sided punishment expedition many officers in London had confidently expected when they first sailed for Boston. The Bunker Hill Monument stands today on Breed's Hill in what is now part of Boston, a 221-foot granite obelisk whose cornerstone was laid 50 years after the battle, in 1825, with the Marquis de Lafayette himself in attendance alongside dozens of aging veterans of the original fight. Standing at its base today, looking out over a neighborhood that has long since grown up around the old battlefield, it takes some imagination to picture the terraced lines of British soldiers climbing that same gentle slope 3 times in a single afternoon, or the moment their commanders realized that a war they had expected to end quickly had just become something else entirely. The British got their hill that day. It would be hard to find a battle in the entire war where winning cost an army more, or convinced its own generals more thoroughly that they were not fighting the kind of enemy they thought they had signed up to fight. If this kind of overlooked turning point is your thing, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and leave a comment telling us which forgotten battle or commander you want us to cover next.